Clara Whitfield was 19 years old the morning her father sat her down at the kitchen table, folded his thick hands together, and told her she was going to marry a man she had never loved. His name was Douglas Renner. He was 41, a business partner of her father's, a man with cold gray eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. The wedding was planned for 6 weeks away. Clara was not asked for her opinion. She was not asked for anything at all. She had grown up in the small town of Morrow Creek, South Dakota, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the church sat at the center of the town square, and where a girl's value was quietly measured by how gracefully she could disappear into a man's shadow. Her mother had done it. Her grandmother had done it before that. And now, sitting at that kitchen table with a glass of untouched orange juice sweating in front of her, Clara understood that the same fate had been sewn into her name long before she was born. She tried once to object. She stood up from the table, her voice barely above a whisper, and said that she did not want this. Her father looked at her the way a man looks at a weather forecast he finds inconvenient, briefly without real concern, and then he turned back to his coffee. Her mother, standing at the sink with her back to the room, did not turn around at all. The wedding happened on a cold Saturday in October. Clara wore a white dress that felt like a costume. She said the words she was told to say. She signed the paper she was told to sign. And that night, in the house Douglas had already chosen for them without ever asking what she might like, she sat alone in a bathroom with the door locked and cried until she had nothing left inside her. She signed the paper she was told to sign, and quietly, without a sound, her old life ended. The years that followed were not marked by violence in the way people imagine when they hear the word abuse. There were no broken bones. There were no hospital visits that required explanation. What Douglas did to Clara was quieter and more thorough than that. He took away her money first, placing everything in a joint account that only he could access without question. Then he took her friendships, one, by making social gatherings uncomfortable enough that she stopped accepting invitations. He took her opinions by interrupting her mid-sentence until she stopped starting sentences. And finally, most completely, he took her sense of herself by replacing it with his version of who she was supposed to be. By the time Clara was 26, she had stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror. She moved through her days like a figure in someone else's dream. She cooked the meals Douglas preferred. She wore the clothes he approved of. She answered the phone with the warmth of a woman who had everything, because that was the performance required. To the outside world, she was a quiet, content wife. Inside, she was disappearing in real time, cell by cell, breath by quiet breath. The breaking point, when it came, arrived not with a bang but with a whisper. She was standing in the kitchen one Tuesday afternoon, stirring soup that she did not plan to eat, when she realized she could not remember the last time she had made a single choice for herself. Not what to eat. Not what to read. Not even what time to sleep. She put down the spoon, walked to the window, and looked out at the flat South Dakota plain stretching endlessly in every direction. She thought about running. Then she thought about where she would go. And the answer, terrifying and honest, was nowhere. She had been so thoroughly erased that she no longer knew what she wanted. She did not know who she was without the walls Douglas had built around her. That was the most devastating truth of all. The cage had worked so well that she had begun to mistake it for herself. The moment that changed everything arrived on a Thursday night in late March when the wind was howling across the plains and ice was forming on the window glass. Douglas had come home late and dinner was cold, and that was enough. He did not raise his hand. He did not need to. He stood in the kitchen doorway and spoke to her in the measured, deliberate tone that she had come to fear more than any shout, a voice like a slow blade, precise and patient, designed to make her feel small in a way that left no visible marks. He told her she was useless. He told her she embarrassed him. He told her she was lucky any man had agreed to make something of her. Clara stood perfectly still while he spoke. She had learned stillness as a survival tool. If she did not move, did not react, the words landed and passed, like stones thrown into deep water. But that night something different happened. Something inside her, something she had believed was long dead, cracked open. It was not rage, not yet. It was something smaller and more dangerous, clarity. For just one moment she saw herself from the outside. She saw a woman standing in her own kitchen, being spoken to like a piece of furniture, and she thought, with a calmness that surprised her, this is not living. This is not even surviving. This is just waiting to disappear completely. Douglas went to bed at 10 o'clock. He always did. Order was important to him. Clara waited in the dark living room until she heard his breathing shift into sleep. Then she moved. She did not plan it. She had no bag packed, no money saved, no destination in mind. She pulled on her coat and her boots, took the $38 she kept hidden inside a book of poetry on the third shelf, a book Douglas had never touched, and walked out the front door without looking back. She had $38, no plan, and the most terrifying thing she had ever owned, her own decision. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind was brutal across the open road, and her coat was not built for this kind of night. She walked for 20 minutes before headlights swept across her. The truck slowed. An older woman with kind eyes and a weathered face rolled down the window and asked where she was going. Clara told the truth, she did not know. The woman, without asking another question, said, "Get in." Her name was Ruth. She smelled like pine soap and burnt coffee, and she did not push Clara for more than she was ready to give. She drove her 40 miles east to the town of Cedar Falls and left her at a small motel with a light still on in the office window. She pressed 2 folded 20s into Clara's hand, told her that leaving was the hardest part and also the bravest, and then she drove away into the dark like something from a dream. Clara spent 5 days in that motel room. She ate crackers from a vending machine and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel the full, crushing weight of what she had done. There was terror, real, physical terror, at the thought of what Douglas would do, what her father would say, what the town would whisper. There was also something else. Something unfamiliar and fragile that she did not have a name for yet. Later, she would understand it had been the first quiet breath of freedom she had drawn in 7 years. On the 6th day, she called a women's shelter 2 towns over. They came and got her. They sat with her in a warm room and helped her understand that what had happened to her had a name. That it was not her fault. That she was not crazy. That she was not alone. She heard these words and believed almost none of them, yet. But she held on to them anyway, the way a drowning person holds on to anything solid that comes within reach, not because they trust it completely but because letting go means going under. The divorce took 8 months. Douglas contested everything. He was polished and convincing and the kind of man who made people in courtrooms lean forward when he spoke. Clara had a legal aid attorney named Sandra who was 29 years old and absolutely relentless. Together, they fought through every delay and every tactic until the day a judge signed the final order and Clara walked out of a courthouse in South Dakota as a free woman, broke, exhausted, and completely uncertain about what came next. But free. Terrifyingly, finally, undeniably free. Freedom, Clara discovered, was not the same thing as healing. It took her a long time to understand that distinction, longer than she expected and longer than anyone around her seemed to think it should take. People smiled at her and said things like, "You're out now. That's what matters," as if escape were a finish line rather than a starting point. But Clara knew, in the deep and private way that only survivors know, that she had left the cage but carried the cage with her. It lived in her nervous system. It lived in the way she flinched when a man raised his voice nearby. It lived in the way she apologized automatically, reflexively, for taking up space. She moved to Rapid City with nothing but a duffel bag and the name of a woman at the shelter who knew of a cheap room for rent above a laundromat on 5th Street. The room was small and smelled of old detergent and the pipes knocked through the night, but it was hers. No one could walk through that door without her permission. That single fact, the lock on the door and the key in her hand, was more valuable to her than anything she had owned in the years of her marriage. She found work at a diner 3 blocks away. Early mornings, late nights, coffee and eggs and pie, and the particular exhaustion of being on your feet for 8 hours while pretending to be cheerful for strangers. She was good at pretending. It was a skill Douglas had refined in her over many years. She smiled at the right moments, refilled cups without being asked, remembered how people took their orders. The tips were modest but reliable, and slowly, month by month, she built a small, fragile life on top of the rubble of the one she had escaped. She had left the cage, but the cage had not yet left her. It lived in her bones, in her breath, in every room she entered. But the nights were hard. The nights were when the silence became a different kind of noise. She would lie in her narrow bed above the laundromat and listen to the machine spinning below and think about all the years she had lost, years she would never get back, years of youth and possibility that had been handed to someone else without her consent. She thought about the girl she had been at 19, before the wedding, before Douglas, before all of it. That girl had laughed easily. That girl had wanted to study art. That girl had believed the world held something worth reaching for. Clara could barely recognize her. Depression settled over her like fog settles over a valley, slowly, completely, without a precise moment of arrival. She went to work and came home and ate soup from a can and slept too many hours and felt guilty about sleeping too many hours. She stopped calling the friends from the shelter who had tried to stay in touch. She told herself she was fine, and telling herself that lie was its own kind of exhaustion. Therapists, she knew, were what she needed. But therapy cost money she did not have, and shame cost nothing, so shame was what she carried instead. What saved her from the worst of it was a woman named May, a regular at the diner who was 73 years old, sharp as a blade, and completely uninterested in small talk. May had grown up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, moved to the city in her 40s and returned most weekends. She drank black coffee and read thick paperback novels and watched Clara with the quiet attention of someone who had seen many things and wasted none of her observation. One afternoon in February, when the diner was nearly empty and the sleet was coming sideways against the windows, May set down her book and said simply, "You're carrying something heavier than that tray, girl. And you don't have to carry it alone." Clara did not cry. She was too tired to cry. But she sat down in the chair across from May, something she had never done with a customer, and told the truth for the first time in months. And May listened without interrupting, without flinching, without offering solutions before she had heard the whole of it. When Clara finished, May was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There's someone I want you to meet. He doesn't fix people, no one can do that for you. But he has a way of helping you remember who you were before the world got its hands on you." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and slid it across the table. It had a name on it and an address and nothing else. The name was Joseph Crowfeather. Joseph Crowfeather lived on 30 acres of grassland 20 miles outside of Rapid City, on land that had been in his family's keeping for 4 generations. He was 67 years old, a former chief of his Lakota band, and a man who carried himself with a stillness that Clara noticed the moment she pulled her borrowed car to the end of his dirt road and saw him standing outside. He was not what she expected, though she realized arriving there, that she had built an image in her mind without meaning to, some vague idea drawn from other people's stories. The real man was quieter than any image. He wore old work boots and a flannel shirt and held a cup of tea in both hands and looked at her the way the sky looks at everything, openly, without judgment, without hurry. She introduced herself. He nodded and said, "May called." Then he gestured toward 2 wooden chairs set outside facing the open plain, and they sat, and for a long time he said nothing at all. Clara waited for him to begin, to ask questions, to conduct whatever process she had imagined. He didn't. He just sat there with his tea, watching the grass move in the wind, comfortable in the silence the way only a person who has made peace with the world can be. It unnerved her at first. Then, slowly, it did something else. It calmed her. She had spent so many years surrounded by a man who filled every silence with something dangerous that silence itself had become a threat. Sitting here beside this man in all that open quiet, she felt it differently. Safe. Empty in a good way, the way a room is empty before you fill it with things you love. After perhaps 20 minutes, Joseph spoke. He told her about the Lakota concept of the soul, how his people believed that when a person suffered a great trauma, part of their spirit could break away and become lost. Not destroyed. Lost. He said the work of healing was not rebuilding what was broken but going back for what was lost, calling it home, making the self whole again. He said this without ceremony, without drama, as though it were simply a practical fact about human beings that he had found useful to know. He said the soul doesn't shatter. It wanders. And healing isn't repair, it's the long journey home to yourself. Clara came back the following Saturday. And the Saturday after that. Joseph never asked her to. He never scheduled anything or made a program or offered a curriculum. He simply left the 2 chairs out. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat in near silence and walked the land together while he pointed out plants and birds and told her their names in Lakota, and she found herself memorizing them, not because she tried to, but because learning new words for things made the world feel larger and more full of possibility. He taught her to build a small fire in the right way, with patience and attention to the wind. He taught her about the medicine wheel and what each direction meant. He taught her that the earth under her feet had its own memory and that standing on it barefoot could remind a body what it felt like to be held. He also told her his own story. He did not pretend to be untouched by grief. His wife had died 11 years earlier. He had lost a son to addiction before that, a wound so deep he said it had changed the very shape of him. He had sat with that loss in the traditional way his elders taught him, not avoiding it, not rushing past it, but sitting with it like sitting beside a fire, close enough to feel the heat, far enough not to be burned. He told her this not to compare suffering but to make one thing clear. Survival is not a single decision made in a single night. It is 1,000 small decisions made in 1,000 quiet moments no one else sees. One afternoon, near the end of summer, Joseph handed her a piece of charcoal and a large flat stone and asked her to draw something, anything. She laughed. She told him she hadn't drawn in years. He said nothing. She picked up the charcoal, and her hand moved before her mind caught up, and what appeared on the stone was a bird in flight, rough and unpolished and entirely honest. She stared at it for a long time. Then Joseph said quietly, "There she is." Clara looked at the drawing and understood he was not talking about the bird. He was talking about the 19-year-old girl who had wanted to study art, the one she had believed was gone for good. She was not gone. She had been waiting, patient and stubborn and alive, in the space between who Clara had been forced to become and who she had always truly been. Clara did not transform overnight. She would be the first to tell you that. Healing, real healing, the kind that changes the architecture of how you move through the world, does not work on a schedule and it does not arrive with music playing in the background. It comes in increments. It comes in the moment you realize you said no to something and felt no guilt. It comes in the morning you wake up and your first thought is not about Douglas, not about the marriage, not about all the years that were taken from you, but about something simple and forward-facing. A new day, a cup of coffee, the light coming through the window at a particular angle that strikes you as beautiful. She enrolled in an art class at the community college in Rapid City in the spring of the following year. She was 31 years old, the oldest student in the room by 8 years, and she sat in the back and held a pencil and felt something she had almost forgotten was possible: anticipation. Not dread, not the bracing numbness she had used to survive the years with Douglas, but genuine, warm, forward-leaning anticipation. Her instructor, a compact woman named Professor Denise Harlow, noticed immediately that Clara drew with the intensity of someone not just learning a skill but recovering a language. "You've done this before," Denise said one evening, looking at a charcoal sketch Clara had produced of the South Dakota plain at dusk. Clara said it had been a long time. Denise looked at the drawing again and said, "Well, it remembers you." She went back to Joseph's land that summer and the summer after that, and not only for herself. She began bringing women from the shelter where she now volunteered, women at various stages of their own escapes, their own rebuilding, and Joseph welcomed them without ceremony, without agenda, the same way he had welcomed her. With open land, with silence, with the kind of presence that asks nothing and offers everything. He built a relationship with the shelter that grew slowly and organically, and eventually Clara helped formalize it into a monthly program. One Saturday a month, women would come to the land, and Joseph and his family would share food and stories and traditional practices, and something quiet and important would happen in the space between people who had been through very different kinds of suffering and recognized each other anyway. She had come to him broken. Now she came back as a bridge, carrying other women toward the same open land that had found her. Clara's art began to sell. Slowly at first, a piece here, a piece there at a small gallery in town that took a chance on her. Then with more momentum. She painted the plains. She painted the medicine wheel in colors that felt like memory. She painted a woman walking out of a house in the dark, $38 in her pocket and nothing behind her but the beginning of her real life. A collector in Sioux Falls bought that last painting and said it made him feel something he couldn't name. Clara smiled and said she understood that feeling exactly. She named the painting after the thing she had lacked for so long and found at last in a pair of wooden chairs facing the open wind, reclaimed. She thought about Douglas sometimes. Less with time, but she thought about him. She did not wish him ill. She did not wish him well. She had simply placed him in the past, which was the only place he could no longer hurt her. She thought about her father too, and her mother, and the kitchen table where her life had been rerouted without her consent. She had not spoken to them in 3 years. The grief of that estrangement was real, but it was clean, the way the grief of letting go of something that was hurting you is always clean, even when it is also sad. On a clear morning in October, 3 years after that first desperate walk down a freezing road with $38 and no plan, Clara stood on Joseph's land in bare feet, feeling the cold grass under her heels and the sun on her face, and she understood something with her whole body rather than just her mind. She understood that she was not what had been done to her. She was not the marriage, not the years of erasure, not the woman who had forgotten how to make a single choice. Those things had happened to her, they were real and they had cost her enormously, but they were not the whole of her. They were a chapter. A terrible chapter, with a story running all the way through it of a woman who had refused, even in her most hollowed-out moments, to stop entirely. Joseph came to stand beside her after a while, the way he always did, quietly without announcement as if he had always been there. He looked out at the grass and said nothing. Clara breathed the cold October air deep into her lungs and felt it reach places she had kept closed for years. She thought of the bird she had drawn on the stone on a summer afternoon 2 years ago, rough-edged and honest and in flight. She thought of what Joseph had said when he saw it. And standing there on that land, in that light, she finally understood that she had not been waiting to become someone new. She had been finding her way back to the person she had always been, and she was here. She was home. She was, against every odd that had been stacked against her, magnificently and completely alive.